I met here in Michigan a very courageous man from Iraq who came here because his house had been taken over by a Sunni militia in Baghdad, who was getting threats all the time because he was pro-American. He was pro-US occupation of his own country. He was that rare personification of the neoconservative narrative about Iraq. He was the guy who literally was on the streets passing out candy and drinks to US soldiers when the tanks rolled into Baghdad in April of 2003. His name is Muhammad Kanani. Muhammad Kanani would argue with his family all the time. They'd say, how can you support the Americans? Look at what they're doing in our country. It's a working class family. They ran an auto repair part business in Baghdad. He would argue back with them and say they've liberated the country. We needed to get rid of Saddam and we should be thanking the Americans for being here. So one day in September of 2007, Muhammad Kanani was going to pick up his sister on the other side of Baghdad to bring her back for a visit at the family's house. He had had to move in to his parents' house because of the violence and the taking over of his home by their Shiites, taking over their home by a Sunni militia leader. And his son, Ali, who was 9 years old, came running down the driveway and said to his dad, I want to go with you. And the dad said, no, I'm just going to go and do it myself. And he proceeded to back out the driveway. And Ali came running down the road and said, no, I really want to go with you. And so he took Ali with him. And they went and they drove across town. And he told me we were driving past this park near the center of Baghdad. And his son said to him, you know, Dad, someday I want to go and see that park. And his dad said, Inshallah, son, if God wills it, we'll go and see that park. So he goes and he picks up his sister Janan and her 3 kids. And the SUV full of them makes their way back to Baghdad. They end up pulling into an intersection, a very crowded intersection, and they see 2 armored vehicles. And the men on the armored vehicles motion for them to stop. And Muhammad Kanani thought this is the US military, he was used to it. In fact, he told me when we would get stopped at checkpoints sometimes, his son Ali would lean out the window and say, yes, America, or I'm one of you. He wanted to be in the Iraqi Special Forces. He was always telling the people that at the checkpoints. So it wasn't anything unusual. And as they're sitting there, he hears a pop. And he looks over and he sees the man in the car next to him. And the man says to him, I think the driver in front of you has been shot. And with that, gunfire rang out in the square that they were in that day. And he watched as a car was shot very methodically through the windshield, killing the driver of the car. And then forces from the men in the square that day open fire on it, and the car explodes in flames. That kicks off 15 minutes of sustained gunfire. The people that were in the car that day, the first car that was shot up, were a second-year Iraqi medical student and his mother, who was also a doctor. The father in that family was also a doctor. They had an opportunity to leave Iraq when the war started. They stayed because they felt that doctors were going to be needed more than ever in their country. So as Muhammad sat in the square that day in his vehicle, he was praying, holding his sister's head down, telling everyone in the back to duck, the children to duck. The shooting was happening and happening and happening, and he described seeing one Iraqi man who had tried to run away, and the men in the armored vehicles shot him, and then they kept shooting his dead body, and they would go back to shooting other cars, and then come back to shooting the dead body over and over, and he described the reanimation of this body because it was being shot so many times, but the man was already dead, drowning in a pool of his own blood, and Muhammad Kanani says they kept shooting him and shooting him and shooting him. And then all of a sudden the shooting stopped, and everything was quiet. That eerie post-apocalypse quiet is how he described it. And he recalled thinking to himself that a miracle had blessed their car, that everyone was all right. And then he heard one of his nieces or nephews say, Ali's dead. He gets out of his car and he goes around to the passenger side door in the back seat where his son Ali was slumped against it, and he opened it, and Ali fell out of the car. His brain fell out of his skull onto the ground at his father's feet. I have a picture of his brain on the ground. His brain fell out of his skull at his father's feet. Muhammad Kanani started wailing, my son, they've killed my son. He picked up his dead body, his body, and put his hand over 9-year-old Ali's heart and could feel that it was still beating. And he felt that he had a chance to save the boy's life. So what he did is he got back into his car, put his son in the car. Tires were blown out, the radiator was busted, and he tried to drive basically on the rims of the car to the nearest hospital, Yarmouk Hospital. They couldn't get into the hospital driveway because of military checkpoints, so he got out of the car and he ran with his son up the driveway to the hospital, and he collapsed. And a security guard came and picked up his son, and they went into the hospital. And his heart was still beating, and so Muhammad thought there was a chance that his son could still live. When the doctors looked at him, they said that his head injuries are so severe you have to go to the neurological hospital, which is on the other side of Baghdad, if he has any chance of living. So they got into an ambulance, and he had to drive past that square where the shooting had happened to get to the hospital. And when they were in the ambulance, he described them putting the IV into his son, and his son's arm reflexively just going up, and how he couldn't get his son's arm down because he was like a zombie with incredible strength. It was power beyond his 9-year-old body. By the time they got to the hospital, his son had died. Now, the people that shot Ali Kanani that day, that caused his brain to fall out at his father's feet, his father who gave drinks to the U.S. military, candy to the U.S. military, they weren't U.S. soldiers. They were Blackwater. This was the famous Nisour Square massacre. Ali Kanani was the youngest victim that day, this 9-year-old boy. And the reason I'm going into detail about this story is because we never, ever hear the stories of Blackwater's victims or any of the victims of these wars. It's sanitized by the media in this country. We pay attention to the lives of Sandra Bullock's husband cheating on her. We pay attention to Justin Bieber and the Jonas Brothers. Look who was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. All the Jonas Brothers, Justin Bieber, Kim Kardashian. We live in a society that doesn't put a premium at all, on having a democratic media that informs the population. So I'm telling you this story because it's important to know the names and stories of people whose lives are taken away, including by a man who runs a company that claims to talk about his value-based lessons of his childhood in Holland, Michigan. So Ali Kanani dies, and his father is courted by the U.S. Embassy, and they say, we want to offer you a $10,000 condolence payment for your son. If any of you have kids, think of monetarily. Could you even put a value on your son? But what would you do to someone who came to you and said, I just shot your son in the head, but we're going to give you $10,000 for your son. That's about what an Iraqi life is worth these days. Muhammad Kanani said, we're not going to take any money. The thought of suing Blackwater or doing anything like that hadn't even crossed his mind. And the U.S. Embassy was pursuing him, and he was participating in the FBI investigation. He talked to the U.S. military, he talked to the FBI. And eventually the U.S. Embassy said, we really want you to take this money. It doesn't take away your rights to do anything. And he said, all right, I'll tell you what. We'll take the $10,000 and use part of it for the funeral on one condition, that you take half of it and give it to the family of a U.S. soldier that was killed liberating my country. Think about this. That is what he said, and I have the letter signed by General Ray Odierno thanking Muhammad Kanani and his family for their generosity. And they believed that justice would be done. They believed that the death of a 9-year-old boy would certainly be addressed by the country he saw as the greatest country in the world. So he participated in all of this, and then last New Year's Eve, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. threw out the case against the men who are believed to have been the killers of Ali Kanani and 16 other individuals that day in Nisour Square. And so Muhammad Kanani thought that he would have to do something himself. Blackwater met with him, and they tried to offer him money, and he said, all right, I will sign away all of my rights to do anything to you, sue you, hold you accountable, if you just do one thing for me. I want Eric Prince to apologize to me personally, and I want him to do it in public. And the reason I want him to do it in public is because I saw him testify in front of Congress. And I saw him and the Congress people talk about a document that the State Department had about when victims are killed by Blackwater, Iraqis are killed by Blackwater. We don't want to set the amount of compensation for dead Iraqis too high because they might try to kill themselves to set up their families financially. And he said they called us mercenaries. And he said, I want him to apologize. I don't want anyone's money, I want an apology. And the Blackwater manager in Baghdad, Muhammad Kanani says, told him, we do not apologize. So Muhammad Kanani sued Blackwater for the death of his son. It's the last case remaining against Blackwater. They settled all the other ones for a total of about $5 million. Blackwater's legal bills are $2 to $3 million a month. It was a bargain, as one person involved with the case told me, for Eric Prince and Blackwater. This is the one case left. It's in North Carolina right now. It's in federal court. And Blackwater is fighting with their white shoe law firms. And they spend tens of millions of dollars on these big powerhouse, power broker lawyers. And the latest thing that they've done is they filed a motion and they asked the US Justice Department, they asked Attorney General Eric Holder to intervene in the case and to remove Eric Prince and Blackwater and the individual men who did the shooting that day as the defendants and to replace them with the United States government under something called the Westfall Act. Now Eric Holder hasn't responded to this yet, but let's just be very clear here. When people talked about what law should apply to Blackwater forces, Blackwater spokespeople said, we're not military, so you can't apply the Uniform Code of Military Justice to us. When they tried to go after them and say, well, then we'll prosecute you in civilian courts, Blackwater spokespeople and lawyers and others argued, well, we're part of the military, so you can't prosecute us in civilian courts. Now they're saying, even if you try to prosecute us, we shouldn't be the defendants. The United States government should be the defendants in this case. They even made an argument, and I'm not kidding in the least bit, in another lawsuit filed against them, that the case should be heard in Afghanistan under Sharia law because the deaths occurred in Afghanistan. So you see, this is a one example of a life stolen by these forces and the lengths to which this one man has to go to try to find anything even vaguely resembling accountability. And it started from a simple premise that goes back through time. Just simply apologize. And is told, we don't apologize. What about the 4 men who were killed in Fallujah, Iraq, March 31st, 2004? I know all of their families very well. I know their siblings. I know their mothers. I know some of their spouses. I know their children. These were good people, very good people from Middle America. Dana Zavko, Croatian immigrant, owns a used car dealership with her ailing husband. Their son, Jerry Zavko, was proud to be in the Army Rangers and the Special Forces. He was one of the guys killed in Fallujah that day. Scott Helvenston, youngest Navy SEAL in history to complete the BUDS training program, in the same part of the military that Prince was in, the Navy SEALs. He was one of the guys killed that day. Mike Teague, a veteran of the Night Stalkers, 160th Aviation Division, combat veteran, multiple tours. He was killed that day. 4 men were killed that day, all decorated veterans. And they found themselves in the most dangerous city on earth, quite likely at that time, in unarmored vehicles, short 2 men, without fully automatic weapons that could operate on a swivel, in a place the US military wouldn't even go. So when those men were dead, torched, dragged through the streets and strung up from a bridge, their families tried to get answers from Eric Prince and Blackwater. They wanted to know what happened. Lawsuits didn't cross their mind. That's not how military families think. They wanted to just know how it happened, that they ended up that day. They had no reason to presume that any foul play was there, but they wanted an answer, the way they'd want an answer if they died in the military in combat. And they said they were stonewalled by the company. They said they wouldn't provide them with any information. And that when they actually went to Blackwater's compound in Moyock, North Carolina, and met with them, that they were told by a Blackwater executive that they would have to sue to get that information. Literally told they would have to sue the company. So they sued. And then Blackwater countersued them, saying that by suing Blackwater, they violated the terms of the dead men's contracts. Value-based lessons of a childhood in Holland, Michigan. Is it really though about that? I mean, I keep bringing that up because I think it's so cynical to put something like that out there when what you do is run a company that benefits from war, that profits from war, that embodies everything that President Eisenhower warned against in his farewell address. And at that time, when Eisenhower gave that speech, he wasn't talking about armed contractors. He was talking about weapons manufacturers, Now we have these companies that are operating as paramilitary forces, unaccountable, on the open market or for the United States government. It's a very, very dangerous road that we're going down.